This is Radio Heinlein, Episode 4, Elevation Spoilers. Welcome back to Radio Heinlein. I'm your host, Michael. In the past episodes of Radio Heinlein, we've focused on the release of Elevation, the upcoming foundational core set, and the accompanying rotation of the remaining Fantasy Flight era cards. For those that have been following the spoiler season for Elevation, you've already seen a great deal of cards that both show us what direction Null Signal Games wants to take the game, and what parts of the FFG era should come along on that path. In this episode, I've been given the opportunity to spoil 2 cards from the upcoming Elevation set. If you'd like to read along or just see the artwork for yourself, you'll find links to the full card images in the episode description. Out of the many FFG era cards that will be rotating, 2 in particular have come up in many conversations, due to how important they've been for their respective factions. Originating from the Genesis cycle, the first set of expansions for Android Netrunner, with the first data pack released way back in December 2012, Has-Bayreuth and the Wayland Consortium received agendas that have been with us ever since. Project Vitruvius and Project Atlas. Both of these agendas have been included in a wide variety of decks, if only for the simple fact that they're 3-2 agendas, historically the most treasured ratio between advancement requirement and agenda points. Additionally, both Wayland and Has-Bayreuth have had periods in the game where each of the 2 agendas were the only 3-2s available for their respective faction. This does not mean, however, that the agendas were not valued for their abilities, because in the right deck, both Vitruvius and Atlas had powerful, sometimes even deck-defining uses when over-advanced. To better understand their importance, we need only look at usage statistics. Going by percentage of decks on Netrunner DB that included at least 1 copy of the card, grouped by restriction list, how often were these agendas used? Back during the first restriction list, that is NAPD MWL 1.0, starting February 2016, Project Vitruvius was the 5th most included card in all Has-Bayreuth decks. From the next restriction list, August 2016, and onward, Vitruvius stayed in the top 3 most used HB cards, often top 2, sometimes even number 1, all the way until May 2021, when it slipped to 6th place. After that, it has stayed, with one brief exception, within top 15. Project Atlas, also very dominant, starting at the first restriction list, February 2016, as the 3rd most included Wayland card, and, with some exceptions, stayed as roughly a top 5 card until May 2021. After that, it dropped to somewhere around top 10, with recent history being closer to top 20. Still, a very dominant presence in the Wayland card pool. So, to both new and veteran players, these 2 agendas are certainly prominent rotations. But their departure won't go unaddressed. Elevation brings with it 2 new 3-2s, one for Has-Bayreuth and one for Wayland. Not functional reprints, but recognizable reimaginings. Let's start with Has-Bayreuth. Project Ingatan. Project Ingatan is a Haas-Bayreuth 3-2 agenda. The first line reads, Dividends 1, open parenthesis, when you score this agenda, place one agenda counter on it for each excess advancement counter, close parenthesis. The second line reads, when your discard phase ends, you may remove one hosted agenda counter to install one card from archives, ignoring all costs. Artwork by Kira El Nguyen, and I must say that it's a beautiful art piece. While the scene is different, to me there's something about the depicted Bayreuth conveyor belts that evokes a similar feeling to the Bayreuth assembly process in the artwork for Project Vitruvius in the Genesis cycle. That one was drawn by Emilio Rodriguez. There's no flavor text on the card, but maybe the name, Project Ingatan, might hint at something about the nature of the depicted Bayreuths. Ingatan is Indonesian for memory or recollection. Before we get into the ability on the second line, I want to pause on the new keyword, dividends. Dividends is followed by a number, in this case 1, and it makes over-advancement on Project Ingatan work just like it did on Vitruvius. For each advancement counter beyond the required 3, you get one agenda counter when the agenda is scored. At the time of recording, I've only seen dividends X where X equals 1. Note, however, the parenthetical helper text, place one agenda counter on it for each excess advancement counter, it uses a number for the place one agenda counter part of that text. This makes me think that if there ever was, for example, a dividends 2 agenda, one would get 2 agenda counters for each excess advancement counter, meaning that you get more counters than over advancements. I bring this up because the other 3-2 agendas from the Genesis cycle, Project Beale and Brain Trust, did the reverse. You needed 2 over advancements to get 1 agenda counter. You got fewer counters than over advancements. For the sake of card clarity, and relatedly the experience of newer players, I don't imagine that NSG would want to write dividends 1/2. And that makes me think that if we ever get a reimagined Project Beale, it would either not use the dividends keyword, or the reimagined Beale would no longer have us doing the Beale math that psychographics fans are very familiar with. Now, with dividends addressed, let's go back to the second line of Project Ingatan. When your discard phase ends, you may remove one hosted agenda counter to install one card from archives, ignoring all costs. For reference, let's compare this to Project Vitruvius. Hosted agenda counter. Add one card from archives to HQ. While maybe similar in spirit, there are some very important differences. Vitruvius not costing you clicks is huge. In the decks that don't mind dumping a whole bunch of clicks into Vitruvius, you are not only rewarded with the ability to pull back your most important utilities from archives, the speed of the ability gave you another method of protecting your archives, complementing Spin Doctor, or Jackson Howard back in the day, if you had any agendas in there. It could also be fired any amount of times per turn, presuming you have the agenda counters for it. Did you know that you could expend Angelique to do a meat damage, pull her back with Vitruvius, expend her again, without priority ever passing to the runner? Also, did you know that all of those expends are different actions? So Mirror Morph would actually get its extra click. I know that last one isn't strictly related to Vitruvius, but I'll let you find the Netrunner DB deck that attempts to abuse Vitruvius this way. We discussed Project Vitruvius a bit in episode 2 of Radio Heinlein, around the 30-minute mark, if you want to hear more about the various uses of it. Project Ingatan cannot do this kind of stuff. Let's read the second line again, in steps. When your discard phase ends, that means only at the end of your turn, you may remove one hosted agenda counter to install. Important, install. Operations are not installable. Install one card from archives, ignoring all costs. So, at the end of your turn, an installable card goes out on the table from archives. Whatever you choose will likely need to be protected, or you have to be okay with it being installed naked. I guess you could also be installing on ice, maybe saving you some credits on the install cost. Although I'm skeptical about whether it would be a common play pattern, as I imagine there will be more impactful cards to move into the root of a remote. I say remote not because centrals aren't allowed, but because installing an upgrade into a central seems like it would be comparably impactful to an ice install. Ingatan loses the archive's protection capability of Vitruvius due to no longer being paid ability speed. Maybe you'll relocate an agenda from a weakly defended archives to some remote server with Ingatan, but it's a far cry from what Vitruvius could do in this regard. Finally, this ability can only be fired once per turn, which also limits how aggressively you can use up the agenda counters. Ingatan loses a lot of flexibility, but it does do one thing that Vitruvius does not. It installs, which means that you're gaining a click. Yes, much utility is lost, but this gained click is not to be underestimated, especially since it's combined with retrieving the installable which you most need. Ingatan is simpler than Vitruvius, but may offer a slight boost in tempo. That gained click, to me, it's not just a mechanical difference. It speaks about how Haspyroid has changed, how Netrunner has changed. It used to be that one of the archetypes of Haspyroid decks that one could build was Glacier. When I asked around, one definition of Glacier that I heard and liked was a deck with the game plan of scoring out without fast advance utilities, even if the runner is mostly or fully set up. Most commonly, this would involve a lot of ice, hence the archetype name. I don't think Haspyroid decks do that anymore. At least not popularly, or at the tournament top tables. It used to be that one would run Glacier out of the Corset ID, Engineering the Future, but that ID has rotated a long time ago. The closest Glacier-oriented successor was Architects of Tomorrow, and that ID has, since its introduction, always been present, but never popular, and, to my knowledge, never particularly successful in tournaments. These days, I hear other Netrunner content creators associate Hasbioroid with one word, more than any other: efficiency. And yes, Hasbioroid always had that as a part of the faction, but I think that has grown more important as the game has gotten faster. Once upon a time, we might have stacked a bunch of ice, dropped Caprice Nisei and Ash behind the ice, and then scored out. Is the Food Coats Glacier of old doing the same thing as a precision design that drops a Bran and some other ice in front of Skunkworks and Void? I don't think so. And it doesn't have to do with the cards that one associated with the notion of Glacier. It has to do with everything else. Why is it that Hasbioroid in this upcoming foundational set is getting auto-campaign? A campaign that pays out at the rate of Maryland campaign, and then one turn earlier gives you clicks to never advance out a 4-2, or an over-advanced Ingatan for that matter. The upcoming humanoid resources affirms that in the modern era, the amount of cards and credits that Rashida Jahim used to provide, 3 and 3, was adequate, was right, as long as you spend one turn on 2 installs and playing an operation. Tempo positive is a phrase that is thrown around these days as a seeming prerequisite for even considering the viability of a lot of cards. Tempo. The click that we gain on Ingatan through the install, it has to be there. Because these days, a click must be worth more than just a click. You're in a hurry, and so must be the runner. Ingatan does 2 things. It retrieves for us a card from archives, and it installs. Here, it speaks to us about another thing which has changed since Vitruvius came to the game. Unless a card is doing one thing superbly, it had better do more than one thing and do those well. As Andre from Metropole Grid and Usengrin put it in their card tier list videos after they dropped the conventional letter naming scheme for ranking, slots are hard. I think that most players would agree that as the game has progressed, on average, we've gotten more complex cards. Not always, but generally. This in itself is not bad. A lot of the complexity comes from a better understanding of what makes the game tick. Some of that complexity comes from recognizing that decks these days have to do a lot of things in what is increasingly a very competitive game. Designs seem to be much informed by what would be competitively viable. In that space, your deck will need to face a broad field of challenges and will likely need to not just have a primary way of winning, but a backup plan to go with it. Project Vitruvius does not have a weak ability. On the contrary, also Project Ingatan's ability is constrained by the need to install, so no operations, and install at the end of one's turn, therefore exposing oneself to the danger of losing that which was recurred. Had both been legal in standard at the same time, I'm guessing Vitruvius might have been considered the easier pick for a lot of decks. Vitruvius is more flexible. But maybe Ingatan in the right decks might actually do more. For those decks that don't just need a blank 3-2, maybe Ingatan would even have been slotted over Vitruvius had they been mutually exclusive. Either way, Ingatan is the Vitruvius of the current era, and embedded in its design, I believe, I see an attempt to lessen the mental burden of the game by moving away from paid ability window speed. While Ingatan does both fetch and install, it does so in a way that I think is more accessible to newer players, as you have one point in time when an agenda counter on Ingatan is relevant, the end of the corporation's turn. A Vitruvius counter was basically always relevant, on the turn of the runner and the turn of the corporation. Setting aside all other considerations, this certainly makes for a friendlier card. So, will it see play? I would say absolutely. At the end of this rotation, the 6th one, we've got 14 HB agendas to choose from. 6 of these agendas will rotate. 2 have seen plenty of play, Ikawa Project and Project Vitruvius. There's also Hyperloop Extension, which mainly saw play in Sports Metal. The remaining 3 are very rarely seen, if at all. Remote Enforcement, CFC Excavation Contract, and Next Wave 2. 3 for 2 agendas, and I bet you forgot most of these existed. What will stay? 5-3, Salvo Testing. 4-2s, Lightning Laboratory, Architect Deployment Test, Midnight 3 Arcology, and Ontological Dependence. 3-1s, Stegodon and Mega Pre-Qualifier. And finally, the 2-1 Elvagar Bifurcation. There's also 5-3 Project Vacheron and 3-2 Luminal Transubstantiation, but both are banned. If we go by what is currently spoiled, Hasbiroid will have no self-protecting agendas, salvo testing as the only 5-3, plenty of build-around agendas, and only one 3-2 available. Project Ingatan. Given this, I'm sure Project Ingatan will see play, even if its ability wouldn't fire a single time until the next set release. So, how do the post-rotation IDs feel about Ingatan? Precision Design and Thunderbolt both could make good use of Vitruvius, and they're likely to adopt Ingatan as their new 3-2. In both of them, over-advancement could be a struggle, and therefore most frequently not the plan, but not unheard of. Mirror Morph seems like a strong fit. Yes, MCA austerity policy will rotate, which was the primary way of over-advancing, so more difficult. But wage workers and other tools, old and new, should allow Mirror Morph to get those Ingatan dividends. And Mirror Morph really wants to recycle its tools. Thule currently does not seem to run Vitruvius, especially not the low ice versions of the deck. As for the new IDs, LEO Construction will probably want a 3-2, and it might appreciate recycling trashed bioroids and other tools, it remains to be seen what kind of tempo LEO decks will have. Poetry's synergy with repeat installs could pair well with an over-advanced Ingatan, assuming Poetry's game plan allows for the tempo investment. That's Project Ingatan, the new 3.2 agenda for Hasbioroid. Let's move over to Wayland. Just like Project Vitruvius, Project Atlas has long been a staple in its faction, both as a blank 3.2 and, in the right deck, as a high-impact tutoring utility. It, too, has been reimagined in Elevation. This is Off the Books. Off the Books is a Wayland Consortium 3.2 agenda. The first line is identical to the first on Project Ingatan. Dividends 1, open parenthesis, when you score this agenda, place 1 agenda counters on it for each excess advancement counter, close parenthesis. The second line reads, when your discard phase ends, you may remove 1 hosted agenda counter to search R&D for 1 card and reveal it. Open parenthesis, shuffle R&D after searching it, close parenthesis. You may install that card, ignoring all costs. If you do not, add it to HQ. Artwork by Oli Boldador, and the artwork goes excellently with the name. Barry Baz Wong, the new criminal ID, overseeing some underhanded shipment, with the Wayland representative being just as casual as Baz about the situation. There's no flavor text on the card, but the combination of name and art already really sells how routine this type of transaction must be for Wayland. Before I get to the analysis, just a minor style observation. All 3 FFG printings of Project Atlas included the non-parenthesized ability text that read Shuffle R&D. The version of Project Atlas in NSG's set System Update 2021 omitted this instruction, viewing shuffling as an implicit part of searching R&D. On Off the Books, they seem to have changed their minds, adding parenthesized instructions for shuffling after a search. I'm guessing this is for making things extra clear for newer players. Let's start by quickly reminding ourselves how the ability of Project Atlas reads. Hosted agenda counter. Search R&D for 1 card and reveal it. Add it to HQ. Now, the first line on Off the Books is a dividends 1 line, so that makes it function just like Project Atlas and Project Ingatan. The second line is identical to Ingatan with respect to the timing. When your discard phase ends, you may remove 1 hosted agenda counter. We again see the move away from the paid ability speed seen on Project Atlas to letting one fire the ability once at the end of one's turn. Then finally, what do we remove the agenda counter for? To search R&D for 1 card and reveal it, shuffle R&D, you may install that card ignoring all costs. If you do not, add it to HQ. Comparing to Atlas, the revealing is the same, and if you opt to not install, it'll put the chosen card into HQ, just the same. So, The difference between Atlas and off the books is therefore in the timing, and therefore speed, and the optional ignore all costs installation, gaining you a click. Note that in contrast to Project Ingatan, you can fetch operations. You just won't be able to play them right away, like you get to install something installable. I'm sure you've noticed the resemblance in how Vitruvius turned into Ingatan and how here Atlas has turned into off the books. I can't help but wonder about how much off the books will come to resemble Project Atlas. As mentioned at the start of the episode, Atlas was a very frequent inclusion. For all but the most recent history, ranked at top 10 usage or higher, and only in 2024 and forward, dropping to a top 20 card, which is still very respectable. There were definitely Wayland decks that included Project Atlas as a blank 3-2, as, for a long time, it was the only 3-2 available. However, Project Atlas did, for many Wayland decks, act as an important way to close the game. Finding a way to over-advance a Project Atlas meant that the Wayland deck, almost regardless of which ID was used, would search R&D for a part of their kill package. The most enduring Wayland strategy, still present today, was to score agendas while threatening the runner with a meat damage kill package. Get some imported NBN card for tagging, originally SEA source, moved on to mid-season replacements, and then hard-hitting news, and then you drop 1 or 2 Scorched Earth on the runner, or maybe Boom in the later FFG era. To make this work, Project Atlas greatly helped. If the Wayland player managed to over-advance, that Atlas counter made it clear to the runner that, at paid ability speed, Wayland could get what they needed to severely punish aggressive runs. Another option, if 3 Atlases were already scored, was to find 1 hostile takeover to finish the game. We'll have to see whether a post-elevation Wayland player will have the tempo to spare for getting those off-the-books dividends, but it seems like kill package fetching could indeed be a play pattern that will live on. Then, of course, there was Titan Transnational. We don't have a modern ID like this, and I don't think we'll get assets that do what Titan did. The ability of Titan read, whenever you score an agenda, you may place 1 agenda counter on it. This gave way to what was often called the Atlas train, named after the preceding infamous Astro train, that one referring to chain scoring the pre-errata AstroScript pilot program agenda. The Atlas train was Titan's Transnational scoring a Project Atlas any way it liked, fast advance, never advance, didn't matter, no need for over-advancing, and then getting a counter on the Atlas anyway. The counter would then immediately be used to fetch the next Atlas, repeating it all over again. If you want to hear more about that particular historical usage of Project Atlas, you can listen to episode 75 of the 2.1 Netrunner Reboot podcast, where that deck is explored more thoroughly. As classic as the Atlas train was, that's history that probably won't repeat. Historically, Wayland has, especially during the FFG era, not been a very competitive faction. Fortunately for the consortium, more recent FFG history has been kinder to them, and NSG has improved their card pool by a lot. With some regularity, one now sees Wayland in the corp side tournament top cuts. with respect to the top 30 most used cards, grouped by restriction list, the number of top 30 cards that will rotate with elevation has been dropping. During the latest restriction list, so that's standard ban list 24.12, it's down to 9 rotating cards, which is still significant, but it's a lower number than it used to be. The restriction list before had only 6 rotating cards in the top 30, so it has gone up a little bit. So, what will Off the Books provide to Wayland in the post-elevation era? Just like Project Ingatan, we'll lose a flexible paid ability effect, but gain a tempo-recovering installation. Going for dividends gets rewarded with board development instead of just hand sculpting. Off the Books can still get an operation, but that had better be worth foregoing the extra install. The previously mentioned kill package fetching might still be a thing worth over-advancing for, but I find it generally harder to predict what the place of Off the Books will be. Not just because I have less experience with Wayland and Haspyroid, but also because it's harder to draw conclusions from the history of Project Atlas. Comparing to Project Vitruvius, Vitruvius was the sole 3.2 agenda for a long time, and Project Ingatan will stay as the only 3.2 agenda. The uses of Project Ingatan, due to the change of ability, will maybe have greater tempo, but will have a more restricted set of uses. These things cannot be said about Project Atlas and Off the Books. Consider that for large portions of the history that Project Atlas has been around, Wayland hasn't had a very strong selection of agendas. During the 5th rotation and before, Global Food Initiative would frequently get pulled in for padding, and then maybe some tempo agenda like geothermal fracking might have been added. The thing is, unless you were playing a punitive Counter-Strike-oriented agenda suite, once you had your chosen amount of Project Atlas, Hostile Takeover, and Oaktown Renovation, you kind of ran out of obvious choices within Wayland. So far, this actually kind of resembles the history of Vitruvius during the same early to mid FFG era. But Wayland's situation started to shift after Null Signal Games took over. The Ashes cycle brought SDS drone deployment, System Gateway introduced above the law, and then Borealis followed with ASEF Protocol and Regulatory Capture. Liberation added 3 more, Slash and Burn Agriculture, Eminent Domain, and Basalt Spire. What was a rather lacking and stale agenda pool for long stretches of time was infused with a lot of vigor by NSG. Going from 5th to 6th rotation, the main thing Wayland and everyone else lost was Global Food Initiative. There was one Wayland agenda loss, but no one played Crisis Management. So at the end of 6th rotation, the current one, we've got 18 Wayland agendas to choose from. 8 of these agendas will rotate. We'll lose Atlas, Hostile Takeover, Oaktown Renovation. We'll also lose CityWorks Project, which does see some use. After that, it's all very rare stuff. Meteor mining, armed intimidation, broad daylight, and standoff. We'll be left with the following legal Wayland agendas. 6.2, Regulatory Capture. 5.3s, Basalt Spire and SDS drone deployment. 4.2s, Transport Monopoly, Kimberlite Field, Slash and Burn Agriculture. 3 2s, above the law and as if protocol, and 3 1s, divested trust and eminent domain. Out of these 10, 7 see consistent play. It's a diverse pool of strong agendas, with most of them seeing modern use across different decks, which makes it hard to predict where agenda suites will go. On top of this, in the current rotation, Project Atlas has not been the only 3-2 around, and neither will Off the Books be after rotation, considering Above the Law and As of Protocol. These 3 different 3-2 agendas can make for 14 agenda points, which is only 6 agenda points, think to STS drone deployment, away from the required 20 for a minimum 45 card ID, and just 4 points away from the required 18 points for a 40 card ID. This is all to say, Off the Books has competition for getting included into decks, and even in a deck where it gets included, it'll have to justify getting scored, let alone over advanced. Now, given this agenda pool, what can we speculate about the IDs? Built to Last and Nuvem seem like IDs that should have the time to over-advance Off the Books and probably have a variety of uses for the dividends as well. With this said, Nuvem has been going for punitive Counter-Strike agenda suites, so maybe it will opt for something similar together with measured response. It should be said that decks with agenda suites that make use of Basalt Spire, Eminent Domain, and even the neutral Send a Message might already feel that they have enough tutoring, reducing the appeal of Off the Books. I'm not sure. Bangun, or Bangun, however it's pronounced, seems like the type of ID that might indeed want to tempt the runner with a face-up Off the Books, and with its threatening ability, possibly getting the opportunity to over-advance it. I find Bangun to be a very interesting new take on Argus security, so it will be interesting to see the developments of this ID. Zwicky Group strikes me as a generalist ID, so it could probably do some kind of build where Off the Books would both fit and get over-advanced. But it's very hard for me to tell at this stage. Earth Station, I have no idea what it'll do with Off the Books, but to do something, the ID would have to be picked in the first place, and that doesn't seem to happen. As for OB, I'm sad to say that I can't speculate about what this mini-faction will do. OB is its own little universe, and as a Shaper player, I'm genuinely intrigued. But I'll have to refer to OB players for some decent analysis. Usengrin did a video together with Biblum discussing OB about a bit more than a year ago, but I'm not sure if it's outdated by now. Overall, OB will be interesting to follow. Whatever Off the Books ends up becoming for Wayland, it warms me to see how it carries the legacy of Project Atlas, and how its ability retains so many of the things that have made Wayland what it is. Indeed, with an agenda counter, Off the Books lets you do something that's very Wayland. Tutor a card, show it to the runner, put that thing onto the table, and pass the turn. Go ahead, make my day. And with that, we wrap up episode 4. This episode marks the end of what became a 4-part series in anticipation of the Elevation release. I wanted to say a special thank you to Null Signal Games for giving me the opportunity to spoil Project Ingatan and Off the Books. I started the podcast because I wanted to both hear and partake in conversations about Elevation, exploring what it could mean for the game that I enjoy so much. Getting to spoil these cards for you has been a real pleasure and a great end to this series. As said at the start of the episode, if you'd like to read the full text of the spoiled cards and see the artwork for yourself, you'll find links in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it with a friend. And if you want to hear more, make sure you subscribe. The music for this episode is Mystery Things by Kjartan Abel. This is Radio Heinlein. Runners, run boldly. Sysops, stay vigilant.